Welcome everyone to our final day of the conference. I'm really excited to be announcing the next speaker and our keynote speaker for the conference. Martha Pollack is the 14th president of Cornell University, where she's also a professor of computer science, information science, that's my department, and linguistics. From 2000 to 2017, Dr. Pollack held positions of increasing responsibility at the University of Michigan, serving as the Dean of the School of Information, the Vice Provost for Academic and Budgetary Affairs, and finally Provost and Executive Vice President of Academic Affairs. As an expert in artificial intelligence with research focus on natural language processing, automated planning, and the design of assistive technologies for people with cognitive impairment, Dr. Pollack earned a bachelor's degree in linguistics from Dartmouth College and an MS and PhD in computer and information science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science, the Association for Computing Machinery, and the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence. As president of Cornell, she is committed to building on the university's academic distinction, capitalizing on the depth and breadth of expertise and unique strengths as an Ivy League and land-grant university. By investing in new evidence-based approaches to teaching and learning, fostering an inclusive, equitable community, and leveraging the complementary strengths of Cornell's urban and rural identities, as you can see. Dr. Pollack strives to bring Ezra Cornell's vision of a model American university forward to meet the challenges of our present and future. And on a personal note, I've always enjoyed speaking with Martha about education, about the future of learning, and about what we can do together at Cornell in order to create better experiences for students that involve technology, that involve what she calls educational verve. And I'm sure she'll tell us more about that. With that, thank you, Martha.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for letting me listen in on the end of that. It was quite fascinating. Can I add one piece of advice specifically to you? On the one hand, I love the advice that says when you're going into one of these difficult conversations, make space for yourself afterwards. On the other hand, what I want to tell you is as you're moving into higher and higher leadership positions, you ain't going to be able to do that. So you better also learn how to get things under control so that you can go to the next meeting. It's very good advice, but I would strive for both. So listen, I had pictured a very different room setup. So I have a kind of formal talk here. It's ridiculous to do a formal talk with this group. So I'm going to talk my way through it, but I'm going to really encourage you to stop me and jump in. When I started thinking about this, like everyone, I started thinking about the pandemic, and I started thinking about the fact that there really have been very few silver linings to the pandemic. But when it comes to innovation in education, there actually has been a silver lining, right? Because I think it has forced all of us to rethink absolutely everything about how we do teaching and learning, and it has pushed faculty, even those faculty who back in 2019 would say, "Oh no, you can't teach my subject virtually, can't use technology in my classroom." Even then, they got driven into new uses of technology and have been very creative about it. That first year of the pandemic was a complete natural experiment in virtual and hybrid education. And I think we learned so much about it. So as I talk through today, I'm going to tell you a lot maybe, about what we've done at Cornell and how we've learned from that and what our experiences are and how we're moving forward. But I invite you, please jump in, ask questions, make comments. Otherwise, I did teach for years and I'll just stop and wait till somebody asks a question. I'm good at that. Okay, so look, I do think that one of the key lessons that we've learned during the pandemic is that when we think about technology in education, the most important thing to do is not narrow our focus on remote delivery of content, because the potential of technology becomes just so much more, I think, and so much more evident when we don't think of technology just as this medium through which to teach, but we think about it as the underpinnings of an array of tools with which to teach. Tools that not just increase our educational reach, which is what I think you sometimes mean when you talk about education at scale, but also impact and enhance the effect we have on our own students is on our own campuses. So I'm going to say up front, this is a conference on learning at scale and teaching with technology at scale, but I'm not going to be talking just about the uses of technology to underpin educational innovation. And I'm not just going to be talking about the uses of technology to increase scale. I don't think you can draw a hard line between technical innovation and other forms of innovation. And as I've already said, I don't think we want to just talk about technology. We want to think about what we know about teaching and learning more broadly. I also think, we all have this mantra, at least I've always said this mantra for decades to board members and others. Yes, we're going to do more online learning, but what we learn when we do online learning comes back and it lets us be better teachers to our students on our residential colleges. And certainly at my university, and I'm sure for many of you, the residential experience is first and foremost. We need to make good on that mantra. So I also want to talk a little bit about what we learn from even just the remote delivery of education that helps us on our own campuses. And one more thing, and Renee already hinted at this, I am an absolutely firm believer that educational innovation has to be empirically driven. This is not a matter of throwing the spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. Right across the river, we have a medical school, Weill Cornell Medical School. And like all medical schools, they practice evidence-based medicine. They don't just try out different therapies and different pharmaceuticals and say, oh, they study the impact, and then the ones that work succeed and they continue to use, and the ones that don't work, they get rid of. We need to do the same thing in our learning innovation. We need to engage in evidence-based teaching. Okay, so that's the background, and I want to sort of talk about 4 different things today. First of all is I want to get to that very important point of what we've learned about using technology to enhance the residential educational experience. Then I want to talk a little bit about this notion of assessment and evidence-based education. Then I'll finally say a few words about learning at scale. And my partner, Paul Krause, who runs Cornell, is there, and he can keep me honest when I get to that point. And finally, I want to say a little bit, not about technology at all, but about what I see as the goals of higher education, whether technologically driven or not. My point is going to be that technology is the starting point. What we teach is at least as important as how we teach. And when I have the opportunity to speak to a room of people who are interested in education, admittedly technologically mediated education, but education, I feel compelled to spend a few words saying what I think we all need to be focused on as we think about the world of higher education. So here we go. Let's start with technology on our campuses. For us at Cornell, educational innovation has been a priority. When I got to Cornell, almost, I guess it's just over 5 years ago, in my inaugural address, I talked about educational verve. And I chose that word verve very carefully. And I was thinking of 2 quotes that I used in my inaugural speech, and I'm going to read to you now. The first was from Alfred North Whitehead. Most of you know he's a British mathematician and philosopher. He wrote this in 1929. So far as the mere imparting of information is concerned, no university has had any justification for existence since the popularization of the printing press in the 15th century. The justification for a university is instead that it preserves the connection between knowledge and the zest for life by uniting the young and the old in the imaginative consideration of learning. The atmosphere of excitement arising from imaginative consideration transforms knowledge. A fact is no longer a bare fact. It is invested with all its possibilities. So here's this guy in 1929 saying that since the 15th century, if what we think we're doing is imparting knowledge, we don't deserve to exist. And almost a century later, just very shortly before my inaugural speech at Cornell's reunions, the speaker was Bill Nye, the science guy, who's also a Cornell alumnus. And what he said in his reunion comments were, the essence of a Cornell education, and I'd add probably any quality higher university education, the essence of a Cornell education is to feel the joy of discovery. So what he was talking about, and what Alfred North Whitehead was talking about a century before that, is that the point of what we do in the university isn't just to transmit information to students or even to teach them how to gather information on their own. It's to develop in them this sense of joy, of zest, of excitement, what I called verve, for learning and discovery that's going to lead them to build throughout their lifetimes on that information that we impart. That, it seems to me, has to be at the core of what we're thinking about in education, including technologically mediated education. So how do you do that at your own universities? Well, for years, I can't take credit for this, long before I got to Cornell, we've invested in resources. I'm sure you have these like we do, the Center for Teaching Innovation, which funds projects in educational innovation. We've got something called, recently named actually, Einhorn Center for Engaged Learning, which allows students to go out into the communities and do community-based projects and then come back and learn from that. And of course, I'll come back to this later, but we've got these discipline-based educational researchers, DBERs. These are faculty whose primary research is to study the effectiveness of different kinds of teaching within their own disciplines. And all of those investments meant that in March of 2020, when suddenly we had to pivot to entirely virtual instruction, we did that in a period of about 3 weeks, we were in a sense prepared. We really had the resources to make this work. We had a core group of faculty who are already deeply invested in educational verve. And that's been a tremendous asset. And what we've done since the pandemic is we've tracked the ways in which these faculty have used innovative technology-enabled approaches to their teaching, initially out of necessity, but now because they had successes using them and they saw that they increased the outcomes, the learning outcomes of their students. So let me give you a few examples. Each of you has probably seen one of these examples, or two, or maybe all of them. But I think when you think about them, they really help you, or at least they help me, think not just about remote content delivery, but about technology in education broadly. So social annotation. We have faculty using tools, you've probably heard of these, like Hypothesis and Perusall. These are learning platforms. Perusall, for example, it's a learning platform that enables students to do social annotation before they come into class. And what the professors who used this found was that it encouraged students to do the reading, it helped them learn better, and it also contributed to a sense of community in the classroom, something that's very relevant to the session that we just had. And especially important in these hybrid learning environments, where at least for the remote parts of them, students can feel disconnected. We have a very large class taught by David Pizarro, 1,000 students in psychology. It's one of our most popular classes. And what they do there is they divide the students into a group of 20 for social annotation assignments. And students self-report that this makes the classroom feel smaller. Now, again, evidence-based education. This isn't just the students report this, this has really happened. There was a really nice 2018 study done at Harvard, which used Perusall, and what they found is that the students actually performed significantly better in the class. So that's Perusall. Hypothesis is a related tool. It's a social annotations tool that lets students jointly annotate digital texts, and it sort of crosses the line from fully online to hybrid to fully in person. It moves the classroom discussions from being around texts and into the texts themselves. So social annotation, one example. Another, which sounds trivial but has had an enormous impact on our students, is real-time polling. Many of you probably know the tool Poll Everywhere. It's a commercial system used in real time for students to answer polls in the classroom. Many of our faculty began deploying this during the pandemic, have continued to do so. And even something as simple as polling can be used in a really wide variety of ways. It helps the faculty discover student misconceptions. It supports higher level thinking skills. It creates community again. It's used in creative assessment of learning. In fact, back in January, we actually had an entire workshop that faculty don't come to things, as those of you who are faculty know, unless they're really interested in it. We had an entire workshop where faculty were sharing best practices about polling technology. Here's another example, the dreaded Zoom. I just gave commencement address last week and I was making jokes about, and don't worry, I'm not going to say you're muted. I mean, there's all these jokes about Zoom, but in fact, we've learned some really useful things from Zoom. And one place where Zoom was incredibly helpful to our students was office hours. Students loved Zoom office hours. Some students have jobs and they can't make it to office hours. Sometimes students they're shy, and they just want to do it remotely and so on. In certain cases, the faculty actually could record the Zoom office hours and share the information with everyone. This has really become a widespread practice on our campus, and both the students and faculty really like that. And here's another Zoom example. I personally, when I'm on a Zoom meeting, I got to tell you, I hate the chat feature. Like, I'm talking and people are chatting, and I can't multi-process like that. Turns out a lot of faculty and students like that feature. They liked it so much. Yes, yeah, see people like they liked it so much that when they moved back to in person, they wanted to have that sort of feature. And so they're using tools like Ed Discussion and Microsoft Teams and Slack to set up live chats right in the classroom. Students can participate. Oh, good, I have a question. Yes, sir. Yeah. Okay, there's a lot to unpack in that question. So I'm not going to speak to the general question of why universities are so slow to change. I think there's bad parts of that, and there's actually good parts of that. I sit on a corporate board, and one of these days I'm going to write a whole book about the pros and cons of differences between universities and corporations. I do think that what happened during the pandemic, as exactly as you say, is there was this forcing function, right? We announced on March 10th or whatever, go home, everybody go home. We're going to be off for 3 weeks, and when you come back, it's going to be wholly online. And faculty just had to figure it out. No choice. And we provided lots of support. I mean, when I say we had things like the Center for Teaching Innovation, those folks, and actually Cornell as well, those folks worked their rear ends off to help the faculty learn how to do not just remote delivery of education in the narrow sense, but how to use these surrounding technologies. So things like assessments. What do you do when it's online? Not just online cheating, but people were so stressed. How do you go to lower stress, more frequent low stress assessments and so on? And they did it, and they were successful, and they liked it, and they've kept doing it. So the silver lining was with respect to educational technology. Now, would I extrapolate that from that and say, okay, the next time we need a major change, I can say to the faculty, okay, guys, I know you can do this because you did this with ed tech. Don't know. I mean, let me be honest, I don't know. It's a good question. I won't say anything about Canvas and quizzes because I've just sort of mentioned that. But I will say one thing, because again, I don't want to think just about the technology. As faculty had to be more innovative in how they did assessments during the pandemic, and they started using Canvas quizzes and so on, these low stakes, frequent feedback mechanisms, they realized that that was good. Again, there's a lot of literature out there, learning literature on that. The literature, to be completely honest, is a little mixed on that. We need more research, but it tends to be pointing to the fact that you get better learning outcomes when you do more low stake assessments. And that's particularly true in classes for underrepresented groups like women in engineering classes. They've adopted that widely, even now when they're back in the classroom. So there's sort of another spillover effect. Do you have a question?
It feels like, to say we don't know whether those kinds of interactive quizzes provide learning benefits.
Well,
There are
I'm not
hundreds of
talking
studies.
about, no, I'm not talking about interactive. The interactive stuff, there's hundreds of studies. Where I believe there is still some debate is whether you get better learning outcomes in subsequent courses when you use sort of an old-fashioned assessment, major assessment once or twice a semester versus these frequent low-stake assessment. My reading of the literature is that it's pointing pretty heavily towards the idea that the frequent low stakes assessments are better, but I don't think it's like definitive yet. Maybe you might disagree with me on that.
Well, I guess it, relative to some of these other new tools that have had only one study was partly why I was excited to ask that.
Yeah. Look, with all of this, I didn't mean to suggest that it's up open and shut on any of it. In fact, in some ways, the reason I'm calling out the frequent versus the big is because there have been lots of studies and we still don't know for sure, but it's pointing in a certain direction. There have been lots of studies on active learning. There, I actually think the literature is a lot clearer. I don't think there have been many studies that have shown negative effects or anything but positive effects for the flipped classroom learning, engaged learning mechanisms. Maybe you know studies I don't know.
Oh, but those are about more immediate feedback.
Feedback versus assessment. Where the literature seems to me to be unclear is whether you get better learning outcomes in subsequent and again, look, I'm a little nervous here because this isn't my area of deep expertise. This is based on my conversations with people who
and language is difficult because when you said assessment quickly, I was thinking formative assessment, which implies immediate feedback.
Yeah.
So maybe that's like terminology.
I'm thinking of grading assessment, right? I do want to give one other example just because I think it's pretty cool. And this is a one-off example, but it's sort of another example where faculty were forced to do something and it worked out really well. So one of the things a lot of faculty at Cornell did when they could in the fall, so fall of 2020, we brought all of our students back, all of them. Not all our classes were, many of our classes were hybrid, but they were all back. So a lot of faculty tried to do outdoor learning when they could, because it minimizes risk. And in our Department of Landscape Architecture, Joshua Serra, one of our professors, took his students out on a new field-based course, and it used some really new software and technology, which let students link species behavior and life histories to the characteristics of design places. Remember, this is landscape architecture. And then they could use that to draw conclusions about how to optimize the sites they design to enhance the avian habitat. We have a great lab of ornithology up at Cornell. Everybody's concerned about the birds. Post-pandemic, he's not only continuing that because it was so successful, he's expanding it with a new app called Ezra Geo, where students can go out into the field, they collect data and qualitative information, and then they use photogrammetry. I don't know what that is. Somebody know what photogrammetry is? Okay, well, anyway, it lets you assemble 3D models. I assume what it does is it takes 2D models and turns them into 3D models, letting them become even more sophisticated in their spatial design. To me, this is a perfect example of learning innovation, teaching innovation through technology that has really nothing to do with remote delivery of courses, but has to do with using the kinds of tools we all use every day in our work life to make our students better learners. So we're in our 5th pandemic success semester. We're at a point where look, I was never, yes, please.
Very curious, you had alluded to the differential impact on students with the Canvas quizzes. So it's such a fascinating time because with the shift to remote, I managed all of that for my campus, that the inequities were really uplifted. And at the same time, right, there was George Floyd's murder, and we're dealing with generational systemic racism at a scale we haven't since the civil rights movement. So I was really intrigued as you started to go down this path, and I wondered what lasting lessons there might be at Cornell that have possibly fed into and reduced that gap between diverse groups as a result of all this experience.
So the high level answer, I mean, one could talk for hours about this. And again, I would defer to people who realize this. The high level answer is that the literature seems to be pointing very clearly to evidence that engaged and active learning, particularly in introductory courses, closes the achievement gap between traditionally underrepresented groups in those classes and majority groups. That's sort of the first order bit. And that understanding way predates the pandemic, but continues to play out in what we've been doing in the pandemic. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Outdoor learning, it seemed like there might be some move towards work that was more directly relevant to the learner. And that also is really a strong approach that's been supported by research.
Could be. I mean, to me, I don't have an answer. I don't know.
Okay, I just wondered if maybe the curriculum had shifted a little, that the outdoor
I-
example was
it
wonderful.
probably has, but whether it's shifted in the way that you're getting at, I just don't know. It's a good question. I think I'm gonna, in the interest of time, skip. I was gonna say a few words. I don't need to say this to you guys. Residential education isn't going away, right? I mean, I remember back in like the 2010 era when MOOCs were really big, and there was all this noise about how MOOCs were going to displace residential education. I never really thought it was true. And boy, the pandemic has driven home. Our students wanted to be on that campus. They wanted to be on that campus so much that when we brought them back and we made them sign behavioral compacts that said things like no parties and you have to wear a mask all the time, not only did they sign them, but they actually did that. So this idea that students are going to want to sit at home and simply get remote delivery of education is simply not true. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a place for remote delivery education, and I want to speed ahead to get to that. But at our core residential universities, places like Cornell and many of the places you teach, I don't worry about that for a second. Why? It goes back to what Alfred North Whitehead said, because this isn't just about delivery of information. It's about connecting people together in the learning experience. And technology can help us do that. I do need to tell you about one other example, just because it was such an amazing experience. When I first heard about this, I thought, it turned out to be an amazing experience. So a few years ago, on our central quad, we put a big shipping container. And that shipping container had a huge screen in it, which in real time was connected to a coding school in Herat, Afghanistan. And you could go in there during certain hours and sit down and directly talk. That most of the students at this coding school spoke at least rudimentary English, and you could talk with them. And when I first heard about this, I'm like, big deal. It was remarkable. It was a remarkable experience, and it was a remarkable experience for our students who maybe had never met an Afghanistani student before. I really think we ought to be thinking more and more about how to use technology to connect people. It's just as important as pushing information out to them. We've talked a lot, because of the questions, which is great, about our DBERS, our discipline-based educational researchers. I want to encourage any of you who can make this happen at your universities. It's a great program. We have faculty, tenure track faculty in departments like physics and economics and biology. I think we now have one in the agriculture school, and their research is into how you use teaching innovations to improve education for students. We have a faculty member, Kelly Zamudio, in ecology and evolutionary biology. Basically introduce team-based active learning to the class. So a dramatic reduction, a threefold decrease in the number of students with marginal and failing grades, and the elimination of the performance gap. So here's an example for you: elimination of the performance gap by a whole letter grade in this course over multiple orderings. Again, not surprising, consistent with active learning, but she had tuned it to the needs of this class. I want to point out one other example, is because it's pretty interesting, I think. Natasha Holmes, who is our DBER in the physics department, she has been doing a serious reconsideration of the role of lab work in undergraduate science education, particularly in introductory courses. And what she has shown, looking at multiple programs and multiple institutions, is that the traditional design for introductory physics labs, largely ineffective. Contrary to what all your physics professors would have you believe, they don't actually enhance a physics student's grasp of concepts. But what she's done is to develop an alternative approach in very controlled experiments that she's evaluated, where freshman students, instead of, like, computing the acceleration of a ball rolling down an incline or something, make decisions about data. Do the data disprove the model? How should the experiment be improved? How should the model be improved? And she gives the students time to propose and then implement changes to the experiments and the models. And in one of her studies, several of these are published, One of these studies, the students in the new labs were outperforming the control groups by factors of 5 to 10 in that course and in subsequent courses. So again, I know it's not technology, but we're all here to think about educational innovation. And I think that having people, probably like all of you, whose research involves the effectiveness of teaching innovation is just critical. Yes, sir. You. Oh,
That's incredibly exciting to hear about that institutionalization of that faculty role. We're really lucky in this community to have a lot of folks who have staff roles that are similar to that are learning designers, that are learning engineers, that run, institutional research programs, things like that. I wonder if at Cornell you have similar things on the non-tenure track faculty side in terms of professionalizing the roles for folks on your campus who help support all this kind of educational innovation, technology innovation. So it's not just arrive and this is what I do for 25 years, but I have a real kind of career trajectory there.
Yeah. So perfect. You're the lead into my next section, which is about eCornell. But in addition to eCornell, at the Center for Teaching Innovation, that is precisely what we have there. We have folks there whose whole job is to develop assessments, develop support, and there are career paths for them, absolutely. And that's probably not that different. The difference between our DBERS is not just faculty versus staff, but they're sort of central versus being embedded in the departments. But additionally, I do want to talk about the kinds of roles we have at eCornell, because look, even though residential education is not going away, neither is remote delivery. There are all kinds of important values for remote delivery of education, reducing the cost of education, and technology at scale, right? The point of this, teaching at scale, the point of this conference. We got into the online education business pretty early, back in 2000. That's when we created eCornell, which is our online learning platform. As I say, Paul Krause is the CEO of that platform. There are many, many, many different approaches to remote content delivery. You all know that. I don't have to tell you that. eCornell's approach by design has been quite different from many others, notably from the MOOCs. Our focus has always been a high-touch learning model, where remote students have a significant degree of interaction with the faculty through discussions and assignments, and they interact with peers throughout the course as well. So that's a different kind of approach. It's not just about scale. For many years, and this was still true when I got to Cornell, we kept eCornell academically separate from our in-person campus instruction. We had this hard line between professional development certificate granting programs and our in-person degree granting programs for the students here in New York or in Ithaca and in Doha. I was completely convinced that was the wrong model. As we've seen advances in the technology, if we've seen advances in the people who know how to use the technology, we needed to reassess that separation. And so 4 years ago, before the pandemic, we merged eCornell in with our other external education programs. So these are things like our executive education out of our business school. We combined them and we put them all under the auspices of the program, thereby sort of elevating the academic status and positioning us to now start doing degree programs. Now, that doesn't mean that we've done away with the certificate programs. We've got 160 of them. They're in 40-person cohorts. They're not the 10,000-person MOOC models. Good reasons for MOOCs. But we believe that there's a real value to this medium scale. With the technology, we can blend the advantages of remote delivery, of having people around the world, asynchronous delivery, auto-graded exercises, but also an important level of peer-to-peer interaction and interactions with instructors. And what we found is that for our courses, that keeps the level of student effort and quality high. When they don't get that personalized feedback, that connection with an instructor, we tend to see a drop off in that. Now, let me get back to what I said at the beginning. Okay, so we've got eCornell, that's great, it's wonderful. I could say lots of great things on it. How does it feed back? How do we make good on this mantra that it impacts our students on campus? And here's another answer to your question about what staff do. When faculty teach through eCornell, they do something that faculty on campus don't typically do, and that's work with an instructional designer, right? There's a professional career path for instructional designer. It's not the case that our faculty, when they're teaching on campus, are necessarily or very much at all using instructional designers, but those who have used them through their eCornell experience almost uniformly report that when they come back to campus, they adapt very concrete learning objectives, very concrete active learning activities that tie to those objectives for their on-campus teaching in ways they never did before. So that's one feedback. They also use the assets they create, right? They record these videos for eCornell, for asynchronous delivery on eCornell, and that allows them to have flipped classrooms here in eCornell. One of the most popular of these are, we have an MEng program on data analytics, and the assets that were created for eCornell and data analytics are used. I can't tell you how many students use those assets on our campus. Adaptation of various tools. So Codio, some of you may know of Codio. It's a real-time grading tool for people who write code. Students, you need to use it. If you're going to teach remotely, you need to use it. Now we use it on campus as well. Now there's no reason in principle that it couldn't have first been used on campus, but the fact that it had to be used remotely caused people to say, faculty to say, oh, this is a good idea. Let me try and use it on campus. Beyond, yes.
So the instructional design process and the development of concrete learning goals, is that always done at the course level, or was there also an instructional design process and concrete learning goals at the departmental level for a sequence of courses?
Well, can you answer that?
In my experience, there's it's primarily at the course level, identifying course objectives and learning outcome goals. Certainly when there's a new degree program, it's definitely done at a program level.
I'm sorry. Yes, and I thought you meant in eCornell. I realized you meant on campus. I can't
Either.
Yeah, I can't authoritatively give you an answer to that. My guess is once you have faculty who are doing it at their course level, they're going to be bringing that insight up to the department level, but I can't authoritatively give you an example of where that happened. That's speculation.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You've been using this phrase remote delivery, remote content delivery, and I guess I wonder, do you see that? It feels like that's a tempting correlation, the remote and the delivery, as opposed to say remote interaction or face-to-face delivery.
I'm sorry. I'm using that term simply to distinguish. Maybe this isn't fair to use for this audience, but in many audiences, when I talk about educational innovation, all they think about is online learning. End of story. Online learning in all its forms. They don't think about all these other forms of technology. And I'm using remote or online content delivery simply to distinguish that from all the other kinds of technology.
Yeah, I guess I particularly worried because there was too much emphasis in the MOOCs on the videos, when we know that the interactive stuff is so much more powerful.
No, that's fair. I am really literally just using it to distinguish creation of assets and perhaps remote or online interaction from all the other kinds of technology. Fair comment. I do want to get to the what we teach. So I just want to mention one more thing about scale, because I think of horizontal scale as far in addition to vertical scale, right? Vertical scale is you reach more students. Horizontal scale is you reach students in different ways. So I've been talking about the certificate programs at eCornell. We have a range of social impact programs, a range of programs where we partner with organizations, for example, to increase educational equity. We've got a partnership with Bank of America where we educate women entrepreneurs, 90% of whom self-report as women of color. We've enrolled 30,000 women, 7,600 have completed. And they've given us examples of how this has improved their career. We've got a program with Blackstone, which is doing a commercial real estate pilot program with HBCUs. We partner with the National Education Equity Lab to provide college level education to high school students who are ready for this advanced education but don't have it in their community and get college credit for it. So that's another form of outreach. We are also, like many of you, beginning to have blended and online master's programs. With most of these programs, well, all of these programs really, our goal is not tens of thousands. We aim to reach hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe even tens of thousands, not millions, right? What we are trying to do is find that balance find that balance between scale and human needs and humanity. What works for us, and what works for us in one program might work differently in another program. It might work differently from all of you. But I want to encourage this group, when you think about learning at scale, to think about what scale means in an expansive way. And now you're going to have to indulge me for just a few moments to talk about what we teach. Because as I say, I got this opportunity to talk to a bunch of educators, and not just educators, but people who are really concerned with education and concerned about technology. And I think as we think about higher education in the 21st century, and we think about technology and how it's going to shape not just education, but everything, immediately what comes to mind, at least to me, are all the risks, right? AI. I'm an AI researcher, but I worry about the impacts of AI. I'm an AI researcher. I was an AI researcher when I had time for that kind of thing. Deepfakes, online privacy, facial recognition, the military applications of all of this. There are going to be all kinds of impacts, positive but also negative, from all of this. We don't know what's going to happen. What we do know, the one thing I think we do know, is that the world is going to be increasingly what the military call VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Like, you can measure those things, and we see the trajectory of them. And of course, technology is going to play an incredibly important role in this VUCA world. So yeah, we need to teach our students how to use technology, but that is really just a small part of what we need to provide them to make sure that they can thrive. We can't just focus on the technology, not even for the students who are going to go out and build technology as part of their careers, because the problems they're going to have to address, and I say this at Cornell, which was designed on this basis, the problems they're going to have to address aren't just technical. There are never purely technical problems. They're all socio-technical. I actually think they're humano-socio-technical. So if we're going to enable our students to deal with these problems, it's not a matter just of providing them with hard technological skills, even at a very high level. We've got to provide them with the human knowledge and the social understanding and the technical skills to address those challenges. So what does that mean? To me, it means at the undergraduate level that we need to teach them how to integrate insights from the social sciences and, yes, the humanities with the sciences and technology. And an important part of that means providing our students with an appreciation for how that technology is going to impact people. I actually think that one of the best ways to do that, one of the best ways to prepare students for a VUCA world, is to get them to read fiction, to get them to read a broad range of fiction. To my mind, it's the best way to put yourself inside of someone else's eyes, to see the world as other people see it. Literature and art and music, these things matter because they teach us what it's like to be a human being and how other human beings experience the world. So I think that has to be front and center. We also need, of course, to ensure that they can communicate and collaborate, especially across difference. People often ask me, what's the one thing you care the most about Cornell undergraduates learning? And to me, it's being able to communicate across difference. I think if we could all do that, the world would, I mean, it sounds Pollyannish, but I think it stands at the core of so many problems we're facing. We, of course, need to give them mathematical competence. Thank you. We, of course, need to give them mathematical competency. I think every student needs to learn some statistics. If you don't learn statistics, you don't know how to read the news, right? That's the difference between reading in the news, the coronavirus is no more dangerous than the flu, and being able to estimate that risk yourself. You know, knowing what R naught means, knowing what, it drives me nuts. It drives me absolutely nuts when the press doesn't understand the difference between a percentage change and a percentage point change. Oh my God, it's a 50% increase. Yeah, what was the base rate? Oh, 0.3%, right? I mean, people need to know that. We need students to develop a comfort level with big complex problems. We need to know how to get them to identify credible information and accurate data and distinguish that from junk information. We need, of course, to foster in them an appreciation for lifelong learning. You know, look, when I was a kid, a long time ago, you grew up expecting to have one job and you had that job your whole life. That's not true anymore. People have second and third and fourth, not just jobs, but careers. Another place where, I know you don't like the term, but remote learning is going to be increasingly. Remote learning. Okay. Remote learning. Okay. And perhaps most importantly, right up there with communication across difference, we've got to get our students clear ethical reasoning skills. This technology we have today means that its impacts just reverberate more quickly and more broadly than ever before. So understanding how to deal with ethical questions, appreciating the social impact of even individual ethical failures is key in every field and every discipline. There's always going to be a place for focused job training, especially for adults. I'm not arguing against that. But I think we have to avoid focusing on as technology becomes more and more and more important, we have to avoid the instincts to make technology more and more and more part of the education, pushing out these other aspects of what's important. Because no matter how rigorously taught, it's not enough. At the most fundamental level, even technologists and scientists and engineers have to know how to solve problems, and that's not just technical. If they don't know how to include humanity as part of that equation, then their solutions just aren't going to work. So really, I think where our challenges as educators and technologists lie is in doing what we were trained to do. What were we all trained to do? We were all trained to assess the problems we face, delineate them, define them, explore the resources we have, and then build the best solutions to them. And if technology is going to meet its promise of enabling humans to address the enormous problems the world faces, right? Everything from existential threats of climate change and environmental degradation to growing income inequality to gun control to human health. If we're going to face those problems, then the students that we're educating have to have an education that uses all of the tools at our disposal, technological and not, in ways that embrace the technical, the social, and above all, the human. So excuse me for pontificating a little bit, but I just think what we teach is at least as important as how we teach it. Thank you for your time.
Actually did my I did my undergrad at Williams, and we very similar to Cornell, and I'm at OMSCS at Georgia Tech, is opposite of Williams really in educational technology and the scale. But I guess one of the things I want to bring up and to challenge is that who gets to experience the joy of learning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our society is so unequal that, I remember looking at Williams, like the people who ended up becoming like professors at teaching are having that residential experience tend to be like wealthy, they could afford it. They were able to dream, they have the ability to not go into industry. But a lot of people who are like marginalized or who like grew up without the same resources have to go and get.
Yeah. So look, one of the reasons I personally chose to come to Cornell is because our logo, our founding ethos is any person, any study. So Ezra Cornell creates this university in 1865. It's right after the Civil War, and he says, we're going to be open to women. We're going to be open to Black students. We're going to be open to international students. We're not going to restrict on the basis of religion. In fact, there's a wonderful letter by A.D. White, the first president. Someone wrote to him that so they announced it would be for anyone, but they had no Black students. And someone wrote to him and said, I know a young Black man. I'd like to send him there. What should I do? A.D. White says, send him. The guy writes back and says, what if all your white students leave? And A.D. White says, then we'll educate the Black student. So we don't always get it right. We don't always get it right, but it's kind of in our DNA to do this. And I think because of the kinds of things you're saying, it's incumbent on leaders like me to always be pushing for this. I won't bore you with all the details, but I'll tell you we're in the middle of a big capital campaign now, and one of our highest priorities is to raise $500 million for affordability, not only to increase socioeconomic diversity, but to get to your point, also to make sure that our lowest income students who are already there tuition and debt free can have at least one summer free to do an internship. So yeah, we got to push on this.
Thank you. I thought, I'm just curious if you've thought about actually bringing in like faculty who are industry, like setting up programs that makes it easier for like people who are actually already working, who have perspective and who have like interest to be able to teach like Cornell for, some kind of
short
rotational
term.
academic, like, research and residence for like a
I mean,
semester.
that's very, so the thing about great universities is the faculty, not me, the faculty control the hiring. Many of our faculty are extremely concerned with inclusion and diversity, and they have various different kinds of programs. We actually, for a long time, have had a program called the A.D. White Professorship. Some of those are other academics, but some of them, Wynton Marsalis comes, it's like 5 years of visiting. It's, there's just a lot of different programs. We don't have a single central program.
Because one of the programs at Williams that I thought I learned the most from as an undergrad was the Center for Economics Development. And they brought in like leaders from all over the country, from like the developing and quote world, and they were on campus for like a year. And they bring in their perspective.
We don't have a central program like that, but there's lots of different individual programs.
But I just challenge you to think about who you bring into that residential experience.
Of course.
I just want to thank you for singing such a wonderful song. It just resonates with everything I believe. Right? I happen to lead the Deber study, and but I also, where my question is the last part, which is just such an amazing and important perspective that we need right now in higher ed. And the question I have for you in that context, right, is this is often at my institution, I lead the academic portion. This is our general education program, right? And the key points you raise are so important. And we have an integrated developmental program that culminates with a capstone research experience. It gets really hard at large institutions to find that balance between a really robust, meaningful general education program that's not a Chinese menu option, and linking it and connecting it to majors. And if you put it all in the major, there's too much, right? What do you let go of? So from your institutional perch, what do you see in terms of ways to better knit those opportunities together to achieve this goal that I think is so important? And I just, again, it just made my heart happy to listen to you.
Excuse me for sitting down. I'm waiting to have a knee replacement, so standing for too long gets difficult. Again, I trust the faculty. I think when it comes to curricular issues, particularly at a university that is as broad as Cornell, where we teach everything from animal science to hotel management to physics to material science. I have the bully pulpit, and I can sing, as you say, sing the song I'm singing and try to push for this. But I and the provost have to really trust the faculty within their different disciplines to do this. And I'll give you an example. And since there seems to be so much interest in racial justice and diversity here, this is probably a relevant example. Shortly after the George Floyd murder, one of the things we said, because our students had been asking this forever, is that we should have some sort of a requirement such that every student have some exposure to the ideas of structural and systemic racism. And we thought for a while about doing it centrally. And we realized that's nuts. It's not going to work, because what's going to be effective for a student who has decided to major in sociology or in Africana, right, or in Indigenous studies, is not going to be the same thing that's going to be effective for a student who's studying business or hotel management or computer science. And so we are pushing those decisions out to each school and college. I'm a firm believer that in a really, you trust the faculty, and B, in a really complex, intellectually diverse institution like ours, one size almost never fits all. In fact, there's always a joke, and there's always a joke at Cornell that the only requirement we have across the university is the swim test. And that's been on hold since the beginning of the pandemic, so.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. I just want to thank Dr. Martha Pollack again for joining us and sharing so many experiences and thoughts on where the field should go, experiences from Cornell, experiences from the pandemic. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you all.